Robbers in the Glen. I lived in a cottage on Slieve na Mon in the early 1990s. At 42, I had come to a crossroads in my life, and I sold up my retail bookshop and publishing business. For the first time in my life, I had the space to indulge my interest in local history. And so, over several months of walking, researching, and photographing, I grew to intimately know Slieve na Mon, our beautiful and historic mountain. Of course, growing up in Kiltynan, Kilsenan, the Church of St. Senan, maybe more about that later, in the western shadow of the mountain, it had always been a presence. My father read the weather from its colours and its clarity. We looked in awe at its wonderful sun and moon rises. We looked in fright when we were very young at its blazing bands of fire at night as sheep farmers burned the furze and heather. We listened in awe to its basic stories of the Fianna and rebels, and learned Kickham's popular song, which we dutifully performed at gatherings of friends and relatives at home and abroad. You know the song. All alone, by the waved was shore, and so on. Later I came to know also the haunting other song of the mountain. In English it would be called A Ballad of 98. I am grateful to Doreen Soros of Cramps Castle, who gave me a recording of her father singing this wonderful old song in Irish. I couldn't possibly hope to emulate his fine singing, but it goes something like this. Is Elam Fénig Bula Leod, and so on. I'll sing it in another story some other time. Anyway, although I had the material to publish a substantial book on the mountain, my only printed efforts were an article, albeit of 6 pages and 15 colour photographs of my own, I should point out, in Ireland of the Welcomes, the international tourist magazine, in March-April 1994. And I also did a condensed booklet for a particular purpose called Slieve na Mon and Kilcash, also in 94. And my son, who was only 13 at the time, helped in the making of that book and the creating in particular of the cover. So the material, there was a lot of material there, and but it didn't go altogether unused. Due to a conversation with a local man, Pascal Cahill of Killarney, in 1991, I found a different direction, which focused me on the famine period in the area and which eventually led to a thesis for a university degree, actually Maynooth in 1994. Pascal gave me many ideas and many stories, and I will never forget this particular line. Chaff and oats for the Clorn goats, eggs and rushes for the Killarney dashers. Here it was implied that during the famine, whilst other parts of the mountain were being ravaged by hunger, the community of Killarney were dining on the best. This raised the question of, could this be really so? And if so, how and why? John Quinn, also of Killarney, later pointed out a ruined house in the woods to the east of Ballynockin Lodge, where Maddens had lived. He hinted that there had been an unspeakable tragedy in the family at the time of the famine. Walking through the collapsing ruin with its ivy and brambles, gradually reclaiming to nature the stone, slates and timber, it was not difficult to be spooked by the aura of the place. A photograph I took of the old fireplace was as good as any I had ever taken, but a magazine refused to print it as it would frighten the readers. It frightened me too at first, but then historical curiosity took over, and the story, more powerful, poignant and important than I could have possibly imagined, began to unfold. Starting with basic questions to local people, my research finished in Dublin in the National Archives when a dusty, ribbon-wrapped packet of letters was handed to me. It was dated February 1848 and had obviously never been opened since then. It contained an appeal, a petition to the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland to spare the lives of 2 men from Killarney due to be hanged on the 1st of March 1848. But the petition was signed with the X's of the illiterate condemned men. There followed a seemingly careful, methodical review of the case. But the last letter from the Earl of Clarendon concluded with the awful words, "The law shall take its course," underlined. Perhaps historians shouldn't get emotional, but I may be guilty of spoiling archive documents as my tears flowed and splashed on the dusty letters. And thereby hangs a tale that has not until now been substantially remembered, and that deserves to be given a prominent place in the forefront of the 19th century history of South Tipperary. The story involves murder, robbery, intrigue and assassination, a large and persistent police and military investigation, a notorious trial, and a public execution that was so harrowing that it directly influenced the movement to abolish hanging in the British Empire. Where is this story in our school history books? Who knows now of the Codys, the Kellys, the Maddens? Who fears to speak of 48? At the centre of the events that took place in the locality in 1847 and 1848 were a Robin Hood-type band whose exploits were so daring and successful and so revolutionary against the authorities and the farmers, not only the landlords but the ordinary farmers of South Tipperary, that they were a threat to the whole economic, political and social system of the time. The story caused me to question fundamentally my understanding of the famine and how we, the Irish, behaved towards our afflicted minority. My conclusions are that we behaved, on the whole, very uncharitably towards our fellow countrymen, and that the farmer producers of food, such as cattle, sheep, pigs, eggs, etc., etc., the majority of farmers in the country prospered at the great expense, the deadly expense, of the minority labourer cottier class. The Catholic Church also, comprised mostly of recruits from the farming class, did not contribute as generously as subsequent versions of history would have us believe. Only one group emerges from the famine with any kind of decent credentials: the Society of Friends, the Quakers as we more commonly know them. Their story has been well told by their own historians, but I don't think it is emphasized enough by ours. Brit bashing has been so thoroughly done by others that I won't add anything except perhaps to ask ourselves to remember that although there were elements of anti-Irish racism among British politicians, and in fact more than elements, which sometimes translated into inhumane political action, there was an incredible outflowing of kindness and generosity by millions of ordinary people in England who gave tremendous amounts of food and clothing to Irish famine relief. A similar pro rata organisation of charity at home could have saved many, many lives. After the rebellion of 1848, that avenue of aid abruptly halted. Inept as the rebellion was as a military movement and lacking popular support, it was, however, perceived by the British public as ingratitude, a stab in the back. Perhaps the human cost should be laid at the door of the young Irelanders and their mainly aristocratic and middle-class leaders and supporters. But in any case, there is no justification for accusations of genocide, comfortable though that might be in terms of shifting all the blame onto the usual suspects. The famine led to dreadful scenes of emigration, misery and death. 1 million died and 1 million emigrated. In the period 1845 to 1849, it is generally agreed, these figures are generally agreed, but the tragedy was far from even in its effects throughout the country. No one died of hunger in the parish of Mullinahone during the famine. Joe O'Gorman, local farmer, said from the audience at the Kickham Centenary lectures in 1995, My ancestors put together 700 acres of land at the time, and sure, what harm was there in that? He answered my question. At the same event, my criticism of Professor Kevin Whelan's lecture caused considerable controversy, almost a riot. Joe's ingenuous comments, however, point to a side of the famine that is not generally recognised, that there were many communities relatively unaffected by the destruction of potato crops after 1845, and that much wealth and property was acquired by many ordinary Catholic farmers, mostly. Not everyone in Ireland in the 1840s relied solely on the potato for their main food. Far from it. But 3 to 4 million people, the labour and courtier class, did. They were almost totally dependent on the potato. This is the class, the dispossessed, which was decimated by the potato blight and subsequent starvation. Over 6 million people were not so dependent, that is, the vast majority of the population. So what's new? The poor suffered and the middle class prospered. The upper classes, that is, the landed classes, were also devastated by the famine. Also, again, not the popular view, but the evidence is there. South Tipperary in 1847 presented a scene not of overall misery, but of general prosperity. One visitor, Alexander Somerville, a journalist, paused at Kilcash in his bianconate coach and marvelled at the abundant crops and the sleek cattle in the rich pastures before him to the south. Clonmel, the city of Quakers, was a hive of industry. But of course, hunger still stalked the land, and particularly in the uplands of the Conmara Mountains and Slievenamon. Many hundreds, perhaps as many as 2,000 people lived on the slopes of Slievenamon up to 1845. Ordnance survey maps of the period show a dense concentration of cabins, particularly along the southern slopes from Lisnatubrid to Kilcash. Most eked out a living working for the farmers in the plains below, the Golden Vale, a local spalpeen supply of labour working on the potato, corn, hay and turnip crops. Their potatoes failed as much as everyone else's in Black 47, and the community was in danger of starvation. In the mountain homes, they had an agonizingly grandstand view of fertile fields full of crops and animals in the valley below. The main supply route from the busy fairs. Yes, and they were busy right throughout the famine, of Capawhite, Cashel and Feathered, my local town, to the processors and exporters of Carrick-on-Suir and Waterford went right by their doorstep via Thorney Bridge. This road was then called Boromor, the Big Road. The only thing separating the poor from the abundant food sources was legal ownership. And whereas in other parts of the country this was an almost insurmountable problem, people starved rather than break the law. In Killarney there was a different response, one that was to be dangerous to the existing order and ultimately tragic to the community itself. On the southwest flank of Slievenamon, Killarney, in 1847, was a densely populated, close community. The predominant families were Quinn, Mara, Gibbs, Madden, Kelly, and Cody. There were 3 brothers in the Cody family, Harry, Philip, and John. The 2 elder brothers, described by the Times, that's the Times of London, as 2 hardy and athletic peasants, became the leaders of what the authorities and press called the Boromor robbers. A Miss St. John of Killarney, who was 78 in 1937, said of the Codys that they used to cut down all the oak trees in the wood and steal cattle. They cut them up and gave them to the poor. There were innumerable thefts of food in the area, but only some that were large enough to be reported to the authorities. A herd of pigs was abducted, fairly comically, from professional drovers at Tempeletny Cross in 1847. Wagon loads of butter were stolen at Ballydyne. An ancestor of my mother, Sinnott, was given 7 years' transportation for his part in the affair. Of course, in our family story, the poor man was sentenced to Van Diemen's Land for stealing a pound of butter. Not quite accurate, he was involved in the theft of 47 firkins of butter. That's several tons, I think. Anyway, cartloads of flour were stolen in Ballyboe. Farmers lived in constant fear of a nighttime visit by the Boromor robbers. And although most had guns, the farmers that is, they never offered resistance. William Cahill of Coloran related in 1937, "In the night, the robbers, they'd go to a farm and say they were going to take a bullock, and the farmer would tell them to take it away. Then they would take the animal up to the glen and kill it. They brought the meat to the poor people. Another night, they'd take some sheep and give them a round." So, we have an indication that almost uniquely in Ireland during the famine, there was a Robin Hood type gang that robbed the rich and fed the poor. Why have we not heard of the Boromor robbers before? Surely, above all periods in Irish history, we need to have some heroes from this, our darkest hour. But as we shall see later, there are shameful reasons why the story has not until now been told. The biggest story of Slievenamon, in my opinion, is not that of Fionn McCool, and a great story that is too, nor that of the 1798 riding, a terrible story that is. The 1848 mass gathering of the young Irelanders on the mountain top, but the story of a community in a time of famine that wouldn't take starvation as their inevitable fate, but fought back and took what they needed from the better off farmers, Irish farmers, on their doorsteps. But the story of the robbers in the glen does not end here. I'm afraid the Sheriff of Nottingham, in the form of the local head constable, was just around the corner, and an event took place that was to spell the beginning of the end of the Boromor robbers. In Killarney Woods, on the morning of Friday, the 9th of July, 1847, Edmund Madden, a steward employed by the Marquess of Ormond to allocate and supervise the women workers in the forest, and there was a bit of a problem around that, was on his way to work. It was nearly 6 a.m., the usual starting time, and most of the workers were gathered at one spot awaiting their instructions for the day's work. 3 men emerged from the cover of some heaps of branches. They wore white waistcoats, but no disguises, and at least 2 had guns. One fired, and Madden was seriously injured on his left side. He made a ball, in inverted commas, turned and ran. He made it to his lodgings, Daniel's, nearby, where he survived until the following evening. On his deathbed, assisted by the head constable, he made a statement, and the statement was written down. He named Harry Cody of Ballyknocken and Philip Cody of Boromor as 2 of his attackers. He was unaccountably vague about the 3rd man, whom he describes as a strange man who I at present do not know, but he was like one Ned Kelly of Kilcash. This is pivotal to the rest of the story. There were 166 men and women at the scene of the so-called murder, but none would give evidence against the Codys or indeed anybody else. Even the murdered man's first cousin, Edward Madden, who was sitting right at the scene, implied that it all took place behind his back. The constabulary later asked Martin Rocket whether he followed the assailants. "By God, I did not," he replied. Sensible man. All this is only part of the story, and I will tell the rest of it maybe some other time, but in the meantime, the whole of the story can be seen in the library in Clonmel. I gave them a copy of the thesis I did for my degree in Maynooth. It's called Famine Justice, and that's in the local history section, I believe. And there's another fine publication which could also be consulted there if you're looking it up. Killarney, the School, Its People and Its Neighbourhood, 1989. A full transcript of the trial is included, which was contributed, I believe, by Terry Cunningham of Grange Beg. And this is a fine example of local history, researched by a group set up by Killarney Sports and Social Club and chaired by Dennis Corcoran, Knock'n'Clash. I live in West Cork today and can be reached in several different ways, but perhaps the best would be via email. My email address is beyondorganicjim, Jim, all lowercase, all one word, at gmail.com. One further thing. It's almost 20 years ago now. I heard by email from a Mr. Ed Madden, although he claims not to be a relative of the murder victim in my story. And anyway, he had come across in Trinity College Library a reference to a ballad written in 1848 by a John Larkin of Gammonsfield. And John had composed a ballad that he called a lamentation, but in fact it was titled The Lamentation of Henry and Philip Cody for the Murder of Edward Madden. Now, I have the words, but I don't have the music, and I'm throwing this out at you. I'll just recite one verse. All the rest can be seen at the library in Clonmel. But anyway, here it goes. Here's the first verse. Come all you Kilcash and Killarney boys, and Gammonsfield likewise. The thoughts of this dismal tragedy will draw tears from your eyes. Concerning these two brothers, their loss far to bail, to see them executed at the front of Clonmel jail. Henry and Philip Cody, in Killarney we were born. Little did our parents think we'd die in public scorn. But we, being young and foolish, that deed did undergo, we never dreaded danger, which proved our overthrow. I would be delighted if somebody could put that to music, either historically accurate or otherwise. Thank you.